Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bert Klumperman. I'm the Vice President of the Royal Society of South Africa. In the absence of our President, Stephanie Burton, it's my pleasure to welcome you at this webinar, which is co-hosted by the Academy of Science of South Africa. It has been quite a while since we organized the webinar, but we aim to get back to our normal schedule and have webinars or seminars once every month. The details of those seminars will be shown on the website of Royal Society. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to new members whose names have been shown for the past 10 or so minutes. And for those of you who are interested in science in general and who are not yet a member of the Royal Society, please have a look at our website and consider to apply for membership. Today's speaker is Professor Deresh Ramjugernath, who is the current Deputy Vice Chancellor of Teaching and Learning at Stellenbosch University. Apart from his achievements in academic management, Deresh is a prolific researcher and scientist with a PhD degree in chemical engineering from the University of Natal. He is a previous holder of a Saatchi Research Chair at UKZN. Through his career, he has been involved in several spin-out companies, and it therefore doesn't come as a surprise that he has a keen interest in entrepreneurship in an academic environment. That will also be the topic of today's webinar. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to give the virtual floor to Prof. Ramjugernath. Deresh, the floor is yours. You can share your screen.
Thank you very much, Professor Klumperman. Good afternoon, colleagues. It's a great pleasure to join you this afternoon at this meeting of the Royal Society of South Africa, together hosted with RSSAf. As Professor Klumperman has said, I have an interest in entrepreneurship and in the way entrepreneurship can be used to advance socioeconomic upliftment of society. And he and I were chatting about three or four months ago when we were having a discussion regarding entrepreneurship and teaching and learning. And then he invited me to say, can't you address the Royal Society in a lecture? And I've given many lectures of a similar nature. But I saw, Bert, that you, in the topic itself, you twisted my arm a little bit and you talked about the future of work. So I'll have to basically edit my normal presentations in that regard. And so I'll try to do that this afternoon. So I'm just going to find out, Bert, can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So this afternoon, colleagues, I'm going to speak to you on a topic which I'm passionate about. And I think as Professor Klumperman has actually mentioned, I'm a scientist and an engineer in particular, a chemical engineer, and have worked in the academic sector for the last 25 years. But I've also had a kind of a parallel footing out there in the private sector, especially in the development of startups and small business, as well as working on issues of governance within the state-owned enterprise sector as well. So when I'm giving the talk this afternoon, you would see that I'm trying to tie in not just the work that we do as scientists in the country and around the world, but about how that work needs to be complemented with a greater mindset and a greater culture with regards to entrepreneurship and especially a mindset around entrepreneurship that can be embedded into the science that we undertake as scientists and engineers. So the topic, the new world of work, the entrepreneurial scientist. And I always like to start off my presentations by having this particular slide, which talks about the evolution that we have as mankind. And you see that mankind is on a continual path of change, continual evolution. And it means evolution in terms of the tools that we use, evolution in terms of the technologies that we use. But the bottom line is that over the last century or so, there's been a significant increase in the rate of change or the rate of evolution and the rate of adoption of technology and the rate of adoption of tools. And that doesn't apply to just the, a particular sector. It applies to all sectors that we function in. So in communications, in architecture, in transportation, and you can see that over the centuries, how the evolution has occurred. There's a few schematics over there that just goes, for example, with regards to communication. 30,000 BC, you can see the cave paintings and stone carvings. And then in the last 20 years, the evolution to communication via Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and so forth. So you can see that there's been especially in the last 50 years, a significant ramping up in evolution and change within sectors. And that you should find in all of the sectors, energy sector as well, including the higher education sector. And I would even venture to say in disciplines, even in disciplines, including the science domain, there's been a continual evolution in terms of development. And so we are continually having to evolve ourselves as scientists and as engineers, and the rate of that evolution is increasing ever more so. So what is the new world of work? So the new world of work is about how technologies like automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, we keep referring to all of these things as the fourth industrial revolution. It's about how it is shaping the way we work, where we work, and the skills and the education we need to work. And I want us to really focus on the last bit, which is the skills and the education we need to work. I think where we work pre-COVID, 2019, if someone had to tell us that the majority or the overwhelming majority of us will be working remotely from home, I don't think we would have ever believed that. But in a course of a few weeks, that is exactly what happened globally. So I think, this is the new way of doing things. And even post-COVID and post-epidemics, we're going to find that we're not going to go back to what was the way of work in the past. So it's about how do we now start to look at the new world of work? How do we equip ourselves? What are the skill sets that we require? And how do we then develop that within our scientists? And I'm also going to touch on an aspect about why we need to develop that amongst our scientists. And in particular, I want to emphasize the mindset and the culture of thinking and being entrepreneurial. Sorry, colleagues, I'm just having a bit of a challenge with the slides. Okay, there we go. So if you look at the traditional workplace as we've had it in the past, which is really the remnants of the industrial era, and then you look at the realities of the digital age or of the fourth industrial revolution, you can see that there's a major difference in the way we are going to be doing the work that we undertake. So the industrial remnants of the industrial era was really about inflexible time, fixed working hours, a lot of emphasis on compliance focus, very defined career paths, heavy focus on hierarchy, and there was a premium on know-how. However, if you look at the world of work or the work of the future, there's a significant change. In fact, if you could call it diametric opposites in terms of what is going to be required. We're moving towards truly flexible work, more productivity focused as opposed to time in office focused, ability to shape your own career. Sharing is caring as opposed to kind of a very selfish way of looking at your personal development, focusing on partnerships and relationships and connections, and on a premium on learning agility, the ability to be able to learn, unlearn, and relearn. So that's the heavy focus in terms of the way we're moving in terms of the modern workplace and the world of work. And I think we got a good taste of that in terms of the last 2.5 years of the COVID pandemic. And that is the way we're moving. And that is the way we've also got to start to develop the skill sets and the mindsets of our students that we're training in our higher education sectors, and especially our scientists. So when you look at the kind of personal skills and competencies that we generally require for someone to be effective in the workplace, we traditionally have relied on what I would term the necessary foundations. And those have been things like literacy, numeracy, some sort of aspects of ICT and digital literacy, financial literacy, cultural literacy, scientific methods literacy, learning literacy, and ethical literacy. However, you look at the world of work of the future and the way and the way the kind of skill sets are changing, there's less of an emphasis on the technical knowledge and technical content, and a greater emphasis in terms of what would normally have been regarded in the past as the kind of softer skill sets. So it's kind of things, competencies we're looking at and personal skills, which is active learning, curiosity, a growth mindset, emotional intelligence is becoming something that's coming to the fore. Leadership skills, communication, decision-making competencies and judgment, creativity and innovation, being able to critically think and reason, being able to solve complex problems, analytical thinking, systems thinking, negotiation and collaboration skills, being able to be mindful and self-reflective. I think especially in the last 2.5 years, resilience and a tolerance to stress, and especially in this VUCA environment that we've had over the last 2.5 years, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, the ability to adapt and to be flexible is becoming critical. So you can see that, on one end, our basic education system and our higher education system is meant to cover the necessary foundations for, literacy, as you see on the left-hand side. But we need to start developing the other aspects or the other competencies, which are normally regarded as softer skills. And that is where I think the kind of entrepreneurial mindset and the entrepreneurial culture and that intersection becomes so important, and in embedding that kind of mindset and culture within our scientists and within our engineers and in general within our students that we train in the higher education sector. Now, if you look at what do we typically see within entrepreneurs, and I think when you talk about entrepreneurs here, we generally tend to think of people that have enterprise development, that take something to market, that commercialize it in the traditional sense of entrepreneurship. And there was a survey that was done kind of looking at the 15 to 16 qualities that you find of top-notch entrepreneurs. And this is what you tend to find. You tend to find an unwavering total self-belief in, that they have, self-motivated, ability to manage failure and to rebound from failure, always determined to succeed, sometimes a win at all costs attitude, but importantly, being decisive in decision-making, being able to manage risk and to take risks, and sometimes even to act impulsively on gut feelings, driven and focused, intuitive, multitasking, highly organized individuals, and an attitude that says, let's get things done, let's make it happen. They're never satisfied with the level of success that they achieve. They're always pushing the boundaries in terms of wanting to achieve more. That resilience and persistent behavior in terms of wanting to achieve is always there. They are always looking ahead in terms of what are the challenges, what are the problems, and looking at scenarios. It's very much a kind of a chess grandmaster approach in terms of looking at 20, 30 moves ahead in the board. They generally are open-minded and prepared to listen and learn, highly professional in what they do, never stop thinking about ideas and opportunities. And you tend to find that these individuals obviously have had to make personal sacrifices and have significant commitment to what it is that they do. But probably the overwhelming characteristic and quality that you would find in entrepreneurs is their deep passion. Anyone that's really been a highly successful entrepreneur has this in abundance, this quality of passion. So why do I bring this up? Why do I kind of put down all these qualities? Because you would see that now when I start talking about what is an entrepreneurial scientist and what we believe are the qualities an entrepreneurial scientist should have, as well as what are the qualities that we should have for the world of work in the future, as I've presented in the slide before, you can see there's a significant overlap in the qualities that you should have, and in terms of the skill sets and competencies that you should have. So what are the characteristics of an entrepreneurial scientist? So Cameron Ferris, who's the Chief Operating Officer of Eventia Life Science, he defines an entrepreneurial scientist as someone someone who's able to navigate the complex pathway from the lab to market. Now, I looked at the definition that Cameron had, and I've added or broadly socioeconomic upliftment of citizens, because I think it goes beyond just commercialization. It even talks to socioeconomic upliftment when you talk about an entrepreneurial scientist. And the important thing, it's done with integrity, it's done with passion, and it's done with determination, and it's done in partnership with others. So that's what I would term is a definition that I see of an entrepreneurial scientist. Navigate the complex pathway from lab to market, or broadly socioeconomic upliftment of citizens, and importantly, with integrity, passion, determination, and in partnership with others. He also speaks to the 6 characteristics that you tend to find of entrepreneurial scientists. Importantly, they have to have a strong foundation of science. So they know the science. They begin with the end in mind. So it's not about doing the science, finding an outcome or a result, and then trying to find a problem that solves. It's about understanding what the problem is and then doing the science in order to achieve a solution to the problem that we find out there at the moment in society or in the market. So it's about beginning with the end in mind. They also need to have a strong commercial acumen. And it's my belief that this is something that you can learn and that can be developed. It doesn't mean that to be an entrepreneur, you have to be born with it, or it has to be embedded within your DNA. I think it's definitely something that you can learn. And if you've got the ability to relearn and unlearn, you will have the ability to pick up commercial acumen. Another important thing is being able to manage risk and to embrace risk. Because if you work in an environment where you have zero to no risk appetite, there's just no way you're going to be able to function in an entrepreneurial ecosystem where it relies heavily on being able to take calculated risks to be able to advance the agenda. And then the important thing is, I think our educational systems, it's unfortunate, but they haven't taught us how to manage failure and how to rebound from failure. And you find really good entrepreneurs are not people that are instantly successful. They have tried many times, they have had many failures before they finally got something that has succeeded. So they value failure and they learn from their failures, and that there is a deep learning that they use to their next venture in order to increase the probability of success. And the important thing is you work in networks. They leverage others. So this is what Cameron defines as the 6 characteristics of entrepreneurial scientists. Now, the world is full of entrepreneurial scientists. I'm not too sure if you thought about this at length. In fact, I think many of us in the meeting this afternoon are probably entrepreneurial scientists. The fact that we've been able to develop large research teams or research groups or research units or research centers or institutes, that doesn't just speak to our ability as scientists, but it also speaks to our ability and our qualities in being able to develop and to take forward an idea and to get it to fruition. And it speaks to entrepreneurial skill sets and entrepreneurial abilities. Now, probably at the moment, the most famous entrepreneurial scientist that we have is Elon Musk. And you can see he's had failures in the past, but he's also had some major successes. And the ratio of success has increased significantly over the last 2 decades. With him starting up with PayPal and today being the richest man in the world because of Tesla. So I think, you can see that combination of skill sets as a hardcore scientist. And I think anyone that reads up about Elon Musk would know that he gets very involved in the science that is undertaken within the companies that he establishes and starts up. Another very famous entrepreneurial scientist, generally regarded as the richest medical doctor in the world at the moment, Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong. I think you probably would have heard about him in the last year. A South African who's made billions in pharmaceuticals in the US, and he's also worked very closely with the Department of Health in South Africa and with the South African government in trying to develop the development of vaccines in the country, especially with regards to COVID. And then, over the last century or so, there have been also some very well-established entrepreneurial scientists. George Eastman, with claim to fame, was Kodak. Thomas Edison, I think everyone knows about the 1,000 failures that Thomas Edison had as a scientist and as an entrepreneur. And then obviously 2-time Nobel Prize winner Marie Curie. So these are all entrepreneurial scientists. But I think when you tend to find very, very successful scientists, not just in South Africa, but also globally, they exhibit all the traits of being entrepreneurial scientists in terms of what they've been able to achieve. So why do we need to develop this more? And it shouldn't be a case of just it being a few entrepreneurial scientists, but about how do we in mass produce entrepreneurial scientists, and why should we produce in mass entrepreneurial scientists, and in general entrepreneurial minded graduates within our higher education systems. So let's look at the context of challenges we currently face in South Africa at the moment. So we have a huge issue of unemployment in the country. There's approximately 8 million South Africans at the moment that are of eligible employment age that are unemployed. That official unemployment rate is approximately 28%. It may have edged a bit up in the last year, especially with regards to COVID, but I know that it's probably sitting around 28% at the moment. The worst affected are young people, and by definition of young people, that's people within the ages of 18 to 24. And in that age bracket, approximately 50% of people that can be potentially employed are unemployed. It gets even worse when one starts to look at the unemployed in the age bracket up to 35 years old. We have something like 73% of people at the moment who are unemployed below the age of 35. And, there's no silver bullet to solving the problem. We've always heard about the importance of education being a silver bullet in terms of addressing issues of employment or probability of employment. But even people that have been trained within our higher education sector, there's no guarantee of them being employed. And it's estimated that over 600,000 graduates with tertiary qualifications are currently unemployed. So we have a challenge. We have a challenge in that our higher education institutions are, as many universities have done for a long period of time since the Industrial Revolution, they're training students to be employees. And we haven't evolved that. We haven't evolved that in our science. We haven't evolved that in our higher education system, in our learning and teaching, in our higher education system, to say, how do we make more of them creators of employment within the country and globally? Now, my apologies for the next few slides in terms of the quality of the graphics. And don't worry too much about the slide. What I really want to emphasize here is just the correlation, and that's a correlation which is the link between social equality and innovation. Now, we know that South Africa and many African countries, and especially many developing countries, have a very high Gini coefficient, meaning that there's massive inequality in society. And South Africa in particular has probably the highest Gini coefficient globally, massive inequality in society. Now, what I want you to just take away from this particular graphic is if you look at income inequality, and if you look at what I would term at innovativeness or patents per million in population, that's really what innovativeness, if you're going to measure it in that way, you tend to find that there is a correlation between the two, that countries that are highly innovative are also countries in which you have the least inequality. And so that is something that you should bear at the back of your mind. So why should we be driving the movement towards a knowledge-based economy? Why should we be moving towards thinking in a more entrepreneurial manner? Because being innovative, being entrepreneurial is linked in a way to a reduction or enhanced innovation, enhanced inequality is linked to a reduction in inequality. Next thing is to look at the relationship between research and development, the success in research and development related to wealth and prosperity of a country. And so here you'd find on the y-axis, you have a citation intensity, and on the x-axis is a wealth intensity. What you tend to find is that the countries where one of the indicators is a citation intensity, an indicator of R&D capabilities and the success of R&D, is that the countries that invest more and have a greater R&D capability are also the countries which have the highest wealth intensity. So there again, something for us to think about in terms of us moving towards a knowledge economy and having a greater investment in R&D. However, saying that, an investment in R&D doesn't naturally translate into commercialization. It doesn't naturally translate into wealth generation. It doesn't necessarily translate into prosperity of the nation. A key component is the intersection between R&D and an entrepreneurial activity within the country. So you would find that as a country in Africa, we spend probably one of the highest percentages of GDP expenditure on research and development. However, there are other countries which have far less in terms of R&D spend, but have higher entrepreneurial activity that are probably leading the way at the moment in terms of getting towards greater prosperity on the African continent. So it's also a challenge that we face in the country. And South Africa at the moment its entrepreneurial activity is on the decline, and it's about something that we need to reverse. And in aligning R&D together with enhanced entrepreneurial activity, which comes through the development of entrepreneurial culture and an entrepreneurial mindset, will hopefully then turn the ship in terms of us getting towards greater prosperity, addressing the issues around inequality that we have within the country at the moment. Now, I think many of you know that in the higher education sector, and especially in government as well, over the last decade and a half, there's been a heavy emphasis in terms of increasing the postgraduate pipeline, in terms of getting more South Africans and more students to continue into PhD studies. And you know, our former Minister of Higher Education, our former Minister as well with regards to science and technology, Minister Naledi Pandor, she was a strong advocate for this. And I think you would know that there was a heavy emphasis on increasing the number of PhD graduates that we have in the country. I think at the time when she was in office, we were producing something like 1,200 PhDs across all the institutions or higher education institutions in the country. She had a dream that we could have a 5-fold increase in that and get up to a number of about 6,000 PhDs that we produce per annum. We're not quite there at the moment. We've significantly increased the production of PhDs out of a higher education system. However, that has not translated into what we would want to have seen in terms of growing the economy, in terms of being more innovative, more entrepreneurial. And I think one of the reasons for that is because we haven't embedded a culture and a mindset of entrepreneurship into the training of those PhDs, into the training of our postdocs, so that we then have this natural progression that even if some small fraction of them start to live those entrepreneurial mindsets and cultures, it translates into commercial activity, into enterprise development, and to job creation and so forth. So we know that there's a linkage between the PhDs per capita and the innovativeness of a country. You can see that in terms of countries that have a higher PhD per capita and should we say the level of development. So a lot of the first world countries, very high PhDs per capita. A lot of the Scandinavian countries where you start to see a greater innovativeness, also very high PhDs per capita. So important message from this is not just about producing a larger number of PhDs, but it's about producing a larger number of PhDs that are more entrepreneurially inclined, that gets you towards that building of a knowledge-based economy, greater economic growth, greater socioeconomic upliftment, and reduction in inequality, reduction in unemployment, and so forth. So that's the key message over there. Now, there are examples of countries that, and I'm putting one example down here. I've left the name of the country out, but in 1960, this particular country had just gone through a war, regarded probably as one of the poorest countries in the world. At the time, similar population to South Africa, similar similar population, but not as well developed from an economic point of view and from an industrialization point of view. That country invested heavily over a period of 50 to 60 years in research and development, and in particular in regard to its people, but not just in R&D investment in its people and training of their people, but also in terms of the entrepreneurial mindset and culture. And you would see that country over a period of time had a significant ramping up in terms of the R&D expenditure, percentage of the GDP of the spent on R&D, the number of research personnel, but importantly in terms of the entrepreneurial scientists that were then put into the workforce. The country had a significant growth, as you can see in the figure over there, in terms of R&D personnel, personnel in companies and in universities, but particularly driven to growing the economy and to reducing inequality, and it done to a large extent with regards to building a mindset as well of being innovative and entrepreneurial. So which country was that? Well, it was Korea, Republic of Korea. And you know today that some of the biggest brands that we see globally come out of that particular country. And it was a heavy emphasis, as I mentioned, in terms of developing the workforce in a very shape and size oriented way towards research and development, scientific research and development, with an emphasis as well on being entrepreneurial. Today, that country is one of the major, exporters globally, ranked, very high up in the top 20 most economically developed countries globally. So it went from poorest country to one of the, I would think at the moment, the top 15 richest countries in the world, with a similar population to South Africa within a period of 60 years. And you can see that the way it transitioned from the early 1960s, and I don't have the latest figures over here. These figures were in the kind of late 2000s, 2010s, around there. Patents had increased drastically, not just patents within Korea, but patents across the world, the number of scientific articles and the number of companies or research institutes that they had within the country. So it all speaks to a kind of a very entrepreneurial way of looking at things, together with a heavy emphasis on research and development. Now in South Africa, we've talked at length about how do we take our country out of the current challenges that it faces. We've had a few national innovation plans. We talked about in the previous innovation plan of a knowledge-based economy, and government talked a lot about it being driven by the 4 elements, which was around human capacity development. I spoke to that to some extent with regards to PhDs that they wanted to produce, knowledge generation and exploitation in terms of not just R&D, but the emphasis on wanting to increase the percentage GDP expenditure on R&D, which Minister Pandor was heavily focused on. I mean, she talked about at the time when she was in charge, trying to grow it to 1.5%. I think we've actually gone backwards since that time, when we was probably sitting at about 0.7 or 0.75% of percentage of GDP expenditure. About developing knowledge infrastructures and enablers to address the innovation chasm that currently, to a large extent, still exists within the country. Between research results, we've seen that there's been a massive growth in terms of research outputs in South Africa. There's questions about the quality of the research outputs. There's also questions around how that's translated into commercial activity or entrepreneurial activity and socioeconomic outcomes. So I think that chasm, to a large extent, is also an indication of the problem that we have with regards to entrepreneurial activity and entrepreneurial mindset and culture that's not being embedded and developed within our higher education systems, and especially within our scientists and engineers. So we talk about the pillars of a knowledge-based economy. It's around innovation, it's around economic and institutional infrastructure, information infrastructure, and education. I've spoken about that. And government talked a lot about the 4 of them, but didn't talk too much about increasing or enhancing entrepreneurial activity. And I think that is where the intersection has been missed, and that we really got to develop. And the onus is on us on developing a generation of scientists and engineers that come out that have a higher or much higher affinity towards an entrepreneurial way of thinking, an entrepreneurial mindset, and an entrepreneurial culture, and growing that not just amongst our scientists and engineers, but also amongst the entire South African population, about wanting to make things happen as opposed to sitting back and waiting for government to do things for us. Now I'm going to touch a little bit about universities. Universities, just as I mentioned in the very first slide, you've seen sectors that have gone through evolution and change. Universities are also going through evolution and change, although they do it at a glacial pace, I have to say. And if you look at going back to some of the oldest universities that are thousands of years old, they started off as basically academic training of privileged intellectuals. We then went into the Industrial Revolution, required us to train people And so the modern universities, or the concept of a modern university, was one of, in the last 100 to 120 years, the training of skilled individuals for the workforce. And then recently, I think especially in South Africa, we're probably still trapped in that. We talk about the concepts of research-led universities or research-intensive universities. And that's been something that we've seen now, especially in this country, for the last 10 to 20 years. Every university wants to be a research-intensive, research-led university. And in the last 10 to 20 years, globally, we're starting to see the concepts of engaged universities and of entrepreneurial universities, and about really wanting to emphasize this building of a culture, mindset, and an ecosystem of entrepreneurship that drives and advances socioeconomic upliftment. So if we look at the purpose of universities, let's first of all look at some of the challenges that we face on the African continent, in South Africa and on the African continent. We know that in South Africa at the moment, the four scourges that we have are unemployment, poverty, low economic growth, and massive inequality. Unemployment, it's not just a South African issue, it's an African continent issue. It's starting to become a global issue. And on the African continent, we have unemployment that ranges, in our 50 odd countries, anywhere between 1.7% unemployment up to 30.8%. And as you can see, South Africa sits on the top end of that, around 28%. Poverty, again, massive challenge in South Africa, on the African continent, ranging anywhere between 8.9% in Morocco up to about 77% in Equatorial Guinea. Low economic growth rates, varies across the continent. We have some countries that are doing phenomenally well in the African continent, massive economic growth rates, but they're coming off very low bases. And then we have other countries that have been in recession, so you can see, for example, -8% in Equatorial Guinea, ranging to countries like Cote d'Ivoire, which are currently growing significantly, for some of the fastest growing economies globally at 8.6% at the moment. And then obviously the massive challenge that we're having of inequality. So the question, to be asked, and I gave a lecture a few years ago at TCAD, which is a grouping of, or a coming together of government and business and university leadership, that's arranged by the Japanese government for, talking about African development. And we're talking about how African universities need to start changing the way they look at higher education, and how do African universities start to then directly address these challenges that we face on the African continent, the four scourges of unemployment, poverty, low economic growth rates, and massive inequality. And I think we tend to get trapped as higher education institutions in terms of looking at the three pillars that we typically work in terms of production of graduates. That's really around teaching and learning, production of postgraduate students and research outputs that speaks to our research agenda, and then the kind of socioeconomic impact that we have as universities, which generally comes out through that pillar of community outreach or community engagement. And so we would ask ourselves, are we failing as the higher education sectors in South Africa and on the African continent in really directly addressing the socioeconomic challenges that are being faced at the moment? And it speaks to universities, needing to become more innovative and entrepreneurial, as opposed to being counting focused in terms of just producing in a tick box way graduates and postgraduate students and research outputs, but about how do we then translate the work that we undertake within the higher education sector into directly addressing socioeconomic upliftment and addressing the scourges that we have at the moment. So the purpose of universities, what we should be aiming for, and what type of graduates we should be producing, are really graduates that are fit for purpose in terms of what the country and the continent needs of our graduates at the moment. They need to contribute to socioeconomic improvement through activities that promote economic growth and job creation, and that speaks to entrepreneurship directly. On the African continent, in terms of the Agenda 2063, addressing the African grand challenges, issues around health, water, sanitation, energy, agriculture, food security, the sustainable development goals in general that we have. So our universities really need to become nucleation sites for high-level, high-technology entrepreneurship, which means it's not just about producing scientists, and not just about our academics who are scientists at these universities, but our academics also being entrepreneurial scientists, so that they can train the next generation to be entrepreneurial scientists, which they will hopefully will play its part in addressing these challenges that we currently face through building and finding solutions to these major issues that we face at the moment. I'd like to say that there are 6 elements of an entrepreneurial university. I'm not going to go into the details of them, but they speak to issues around leadership and governance, organizational and human capacity and incentives to promote entrepreneurship, the development of entrepreneurship in teaching and learning, the development of a culture of entrepreneurship within the organization and broadly in society, stakeholder relationships, strategic partnerships, and internationalization. And I'll speak to just some of them without going into too much of detail. Just looking at organizational human capacity and incentives, we need to ensure that we start to pay more attention to building this mindset and culture of entrepreneurship, building support for a kind of entrepreneurship ecosystem to be built, breaking down silos so that we start to operate in a more interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary kind of approach, recruiting and engaging entrepreneurs so that we start to have that kind of practitioner approach to developing entrepreneurship amongst our scientists and engineers, developing our staff in terms of their own entrepreneurship skill sets and mindsets, and then obviously rewarding it appropriately within our sectors in higher education and even within industry and the private sector in that regard. So having recognition and status for external partners to develop entrepreneurship across all of our sectors. Now, why entrepreneurial education? I think it's important to develop this as a skill set, and hopefully I emphasize that enough in terms of being able to address these challenges we face in the country. The kind of skill set, we've touched on that in terms of the world of work and the work of the future, and what kind of skill sets and capabilities are required of our people, and how we need to enhance those kind of softer skill sets so that they become more entrepreneurial and contribute in a greater sense. And then practical entrepreneurship training, which then better prepares them for the transition into the labor market, so that they can see opportunities and take up opportunities and ensure a higher probability of success in business and in the private sector out there. In terms of the development of entrepreneurship in teaching and learning, it's really about making sure through our formal curricula as well as our co-curricular and our experiential learning, how we develop the entrepreneurial mindset and the skills, how to think in an entrepreneurial manner in terms of the way we teach and learn, as well as in research, and about really producing graduates that ensure we have an enhanced entrepreneurial activity within the country. Broadly in terms of the development of a culture of entrepreneurship, we have to raise awareness and importance of entrepreneurship. That's exactly what I'm hoping we're doing today with this talk. And we could have to do a lot more about it and a lot more engagement in terms of how we broaden this field of entrepreneurial scientists, provide opportunities to experience entrepreneurship, support in terms of moving from idea to action to implementation, a lot of support in terms of mentoring and very close relationships across sectors in order to foster entrepreneurship. It's really going to be about building relationships and strategic partnerships. And I've got a few points over here about how you start to build that, especially with industry, government, the private sector, public sector, civil society. But I think it's best captured what we generally know as the innovation quadruple helix. But the innovation quadruple helix also talks about how we can promote an entrepreneurial culture and a mindset where the very close working relationship that we need to develop between the sectors, the 4 sectors, government, public, academic, industry, and civil society, needs to work in an intertwined fashion in order to us to really reap the full rewards in terms of moving us towards a knowledge-based economy and enhancing entrepreneurial activity. And our universities in that regard need to become the epicenters of entrepreneurial of the entrepreneurial innovation ecosystem. And it speaks to the scientists that we also have within our research agencies and in our research ecosystems within the country. And just in terms of final comments, I think I've said a lot. I had a number of points. I've hopefully tried to tie them together and showed you the importance of why we need to have a greater focus in terms of developing entrepreneurial scientists and engineers, but broadly speaking, in terms of developing innovation and entrepreneurship on a much broader scale, nationally and continentally. And it's because innovation and entrepreneurship is key to addressing the socioeconomic challenges being faced at the moment, not just on the African continent, but specifically in South Africa. That mindset needs to be developed, and we need to embed it within our citizens, embed a mindset of innovation and entrepreneurship in society, especially our scientists. They need to work with all stakeholders in the innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem for the best interests of the nation and its citizens. And our higher education institutions need to be the epicenter of innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem, because that is the only way we're going to start to develop this mindset and culture and have it then permeate through society. And it has to be done through our teaching, our research, and our societal impact that we make. Colleagues, thank you very much for your attention. I greatly appreciate you taking the time out to just hear some of my thoughts in terms of why we really need to emphasize entrepreneurship and develop this mindset and culture within the country.
Well, thank you very much, Deresh. Are there any questions? Yes, Patricia, you can unmute yourself. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. A very interesting talk. I certainly wouldn't argue with anything that you say. I just fear that we're leaving it too late for when we're dealing with people by the time they get to universities. The problems really arise at the school level. We get people going into the universities who can barely read, understand, whose mathematical ability is extremely limited. But what's much worse is that their inclination to innovate, to think, to challenge the status quo is completely discouraged in them when they're at school. And we need to be good scientists, to be a good entrepreneur, you have to challenge things.
Yep.
I fear that the worst problem is not encouraging really good people to become teachers, so that the right mindset gets developed at the earlier stage. What are your thoughts on that?
No, Patricia, I couldn't agree with you more. I think we have a serious challenge in that regard. You know, we find that within government at the moment, there's been units or entities that have been established in the higher education sector. So the entrepreneurial development in higher education unit, which sits within USAF, has been established to try to promote entrepreneurship in the higher education sector. But I think you're right. It's probably too late at that point in time. Mm. I am aware, however, that basic education is trying to develop something equivalent to EDHE for basic education, to start to, at a very early stage within basic education, start to instill these kind of skill sets and mindset and culture of entrepreneurship. But this is going to take time, right? It's not something that we change overnight. It'll have to be a generational kind of issue in terms of developing the right kind of curricula within the basic education system, the right kind of mindset, and I think that's also one of the challenges that we have within the country. We don't have the right kind of mindset, that kind of go-getter mindset. It's really about a mindset of waiting and expecting that someone else will do it for us.
Someone else will solve the problems, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's going to need a huge shift, but I fully agree with it. The sooner we can have a very good pipeline starting off in basic education at the earliest ages, the more impactful it will be in terms of the initiatives that we undertake with regards to building entrepreneurial activity within the country. Yeah. And we see it. We see it in countries where the entrepreneurial activity is extremely high, where the economy to a large extent is driven by by small, medium, and macro enterprises, that at a very early age, people start to value being entrepreneurial. So I think, there's a strong correlation over there as well.
We're currently trying to produce PhDs out of people that just aren't prepared for it. And it's one of the challenges. And it's one of the reasons that our PhDs take longer than they should, is that they're just not ready to think in that way. Anyway, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, David.
Deresh, thank you again for a wonderful talk, and lovely to speak to a fellow Natal graduate once again. So thank you for that. Here's a radical thought. You talked a lot about the structural intersection, of the 4 key role players to make this happen. And when you think of having to create structures for something to happen, is not a radical approach to say, very often entrepreneurs are born out of everybody getting out of their way and letting them get on with what they need to do. The problem in South Africa is, for example, venture capital point of view, failure is highly discouraged in the South African VC environment by comparison with, for example, the United States. Yeah. You correctly highlighted that failure isn't a badge of honor in South Africa, it's the badge of failure. The so what with research is very, very rarely asked. It's what is your impact on your paper publication? It's not, so what is this going to help, a new polymer that could be used for photocells? And if so, can we produce it? And how are we going to do that? I often believe that entrepreneurs, and you used many great examples, they did it not because of structure, they did it in spite of structure. Yep. They did it because people got out of their way and let them get on with it. In fact, a lot of them jumped out of university, as we know, because they needed to go and do it, rather than using university as a springboard. However, I do agree with that great point that you did make, that it has to start with a core competency that is deep knowledge, deep science, that gives the unique proposition to the innovation that evolves. What do you think of a slightly slimmed down way and saying, listen, the people are going to be prepared to do it. How can we actually just streamline it for them rather than try to make all the planets align?
Yeah, so David, I think the point you make is an important one. I think one of the real challenges that we have, especially in South Africa at the moment, to building up our entrepreneurial activity is really one of red tape. It's the kind of the amount of red tape that we have in terms of getting anything going within the country. The agencies that are meant to kind of facilitate kind of an entrepreneurial ecosystem to flourish and nurture within the country are to a large extent killing it off. So I think but it's going to need a mindset shift amongst I would think all of the agencies, right? All of the agencies that I have in what I termed as quadruple helix of innovation and entrepreneurship. And that's going to be important. It's about shifting things so that we have a common focus to getting things done and eliminating the so-called red tape and the kind of administrative bureaucracy of getting things done. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face. I mean, clearly you could see it in terms of Eskom. One of the biggest challenges in terms of solving the problem of Eskom is the administrative red tape we have at the moment. You hear the ministers talking about it. You hear the CEO of Eskom talking about it. We got the solutions. Let the scientists and engineers get on and do it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I think in view of the time, I'd like to close it here. Deresh, thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. And thank you to all the audience who was here, and keep an eye on the website for what will be next month's talk. Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Deresh.
Thanks, Bert.
Thanks, Bert. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.